Good evening, everybody. I'm Jean Durning. I run environment programs for the Environment Committee at Horizon House. And on behalf of the Environment Committee, whose chair is Bill Roach over here, I want to welcome you all. I also want to acknowledge that our co-sponsor this evening is the Seattle unit of the League of Women, the First Hill unit of the League of Women Voters, with Joan Lawson as its current chair, and we appreciate their co-sponsorship with us. Joan wears a second hat. She's also the coordinator on behalf of the Environment Committee for coordinating all the events for the entire Earth Month that are happening across the whole staff and other organizations. I've got one bit of business that I want to ask you to help us with, and that is 2 days from now in the evening, we will be rerunning a program, a video of a program that was here from last month about killer tires and toxic tires and killer chemicals. And it will be run on HHTV 370. You can watch it at home. But if you want to come down here and watch it, then we will be able to have discussion of anybody who wants to talk about it, or you come back down from your room. So that's tomorrow, day after tomorrow evening at 7:30. Now let me turn to this evening's program. I'm very happy to introduce Shannon Grimes, who's a researcher at Sightline Institute, working on their democracy program. She focuses on securing electoral reforms in Washington State and Oregon. Before that, she had worked in Maine in a statewide nutrition incentive program, and then she worked in Washington State for a different organization working on ranked choice voting. And then she had a different task that she was working on of expanding federal support for caregivers through philanthropy. Her bachelor's degree is from Bowdoin College in Maine. Her master's from the Dan Evans School of Public Policy and Governance at the UW. Outside of Sightline, she's hiking in the mountains perhaps, or swing dancing, or planning her next cooking project. So would you please join me in welcoming Shannon Grimes?
Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Okay, great. Well, I am so delighted to be here. So thank you for having me. Thank you, Jean, and the Environment Committee for everything in setting this up. And thank all of you for being here. Really appreciate it. So again, my name is Shannon. I work at Sightline Institute, and I'm here to talk about our work on election upgrades and why we see that as essential to building a sustainable future. So, after a brief introduction of Sightline, I will dive into the why of this work. I'll then talk through some of the specific challenges that we see obstructing a government that could better tackle big crises like climate change. Lastly, I'll go through the solutions with some specific examples of the work that I've been doing here in Washington State. I'll take clarifying questions throughout if you all want to jump in, but let's save anything more substantial for the end. And we can have a little bit of a discussion then. A little bit about us, although probably a few of you are already somewhat familiar with Sightline. Sightline Institute is an independent nonprofit research, policy, and communication center. Our mission is to make Cascadia a global model of sustainability. We believe true sustainability exists at the intersection of environmental, health, and social justice. And I do want to actually ground us in that for a minute. So we were talking a little bit earlier about what sustainability means, and I'd like to just take a second for you to think about what does sustainability look like for you and for future generations. Okay, how about now? Great, great. Does anybody want to shout out a word or two that comes up for you when you think about sustainability? Food? Will last. Great. Survival. Water. Reusable. Yeah. I think for me, I think a lot about, I've been really excited about gardening this year, so I feel like there's so many metaphors in that, in planting a seed and something that we'll be able to continue for a future. So our work is really about sustainability, and we do that through 5 main research areas: climate and energy, housing and urbanism, democracy and elections, farms and forests, and then strategic messaging, which actually covers all of those. I, of course, work on the democracy and elections program, so that's what I'll be focusing on here today. Okay, so moving to why democracy matters for addressing climate change. I don't think I need to tell you that climate change is already having a devastating impact on our communities, on our economy, on our environment. Individual actions like recycling or putting your clothes up to dry on a clothesline can help. And if they're the only thing that we do, fossil fuel corporations are going to have won. My colleague Emily was here about 1.5 years ago, and she walked through how we've made some big progress on stopping fossil fuel projects and creating pathways to clean energy. So I think she spoke about transmission lines for those of you who are here. We've managed to have some major wins, but there's also more to do. This map is also from Emily's research, showing how many polluters continue to dirty Cascadia's air and add to the region's pollution every day. These entities enjoy loopholes in the region's climate policies, and they're fighting tooth and nail to maintain their profits. The political complexities of building vast amounts of renewable energy infrastructure are also starting to reveal themselves. We need policymakers to fill in the cracks to reckon with these industries' pollution, or these facilities could keep fouling up the region for longer than our climate can afford. This is a policy problem, and industrial pollution is just one example. We also need policy fixes in other fields that relate to climate, which is pretty much everything: transportation, housing, food production, the list goes on. It's also not just us at a climate-focused think tank that wants this change. As you can see in this poll, a supermajority of Americans, Democrats and Republicans both, want more climate action in a whole variety of forms. 65% say that the federal government is doing too little to reduce the effects of climate change. So why are we not getting more action? Isn't policy supposed to represent the will of the people in a democracy? Well, the trouble is, as is probably clear to many of you if you watch the news, is that our government isn't working super well. Shutdowns, polarization, animosity, dark money, gerrymandering. I'll get a little bit more into the specifics of some of these challenges in a moment, but the larger point is that we have to fix these issues if we want to achieve anything together. This photo is from Finland, but it's clearly relevant for our work here too. Sightline has been working on climate policy for 30 years, and at some point we realized that the policy decisions that lead to greater sustainability rely on a healthy democracy. We aren't able to make the progress that we need on climate that most people want because our democracy is not representative. We don't feel like our voices matter because sometimes they don't. Our elected leaders don't attend to the issues we care about, so we no longer trust our public institutions. We no longer trust that we can govern together. Self-government democracy should be a mechanism to hold other forces in check, to make sure that the interests with built-up power can't hold sway over what's actually good for we the people. It's our institution for solving big, wicked problems that we can't solve on our own. Climate change is one of the biggest problems we face. It's widespread, pervasive, sustained, requires continued action and attention over many years. It's almost the definition of a collective challenge, and not one that we can tackle individually. So we need to believe that we can work together to make real long-term progress. But we can't do that if our systems of self-government are broken. To act collectively, we need structures that will enable that. So let's move on to some of those structures. We have identified some specific challenges, mostly related to elections and campaigns, that really gum up effective governance. So oppressive voting rules prevent full participation, exclusionary partisan primaries, which we fortunately don't have here in Washington, disenfranchise voters, encourage extremists and heighten polarization, non-majority winners limit voter voice, uncompetitive winner-take-all districts lock out many voters, and big donors have undue influence. I'll dive into each of these, and then we'll get into some solutions. So first, voting rules. We know that our system needs work because voter participation is low. It maxes out at 66% in presidential election years. So that means that 1 of every 3 eligible voters do not vote even in the highest turnout elections. Here in King County, turnout was a miserly 38% in the last election. It's actually the lowest turnout since they've been recording it reliably. There are also big differences in turnout by demographics, as you can see in the chart here. So it might not be super clear, but the columns on the left are voters, and then directly to the right are non-voters, and they don't line up. Young people, people of color, people with lower levels of education and income are less likely to vote. And these folks are disproportionately impacted by barriers to voting, which include things like registration deadlines, visiting the polling place, fortunately not here in Washington, and even just keeping track of all of our elections. The other issues that I'll get into in a minute also impact voter turnout because you might not bother to vote if you don't feel like it matters. The barriers also vary a lot depending on where in the country you live. So we're pretty lucky here in Washington, but clearly there's still a lot more that we need to do. All of this is a problem because if we don't have high and representative voter participation, it's really hard to hold politicians accountable for their actions. They don't have incentive to listen to our concerns about issues like climate because special interests are more influential in winning elections than voters. So there's another direct barrier targeted just at certain voters, and that is a partisan primary. So again, we don't have these in Washington, but more than a dozen states have closed partisan primaries where Democrats and Republicans have separate primary elections, and voters who aren't registered with either party just can't participate in choosing a candidate at all. So even though these closed primary elections are taxpayer funded, the large and growing number of independent or unaffiliated voters don't get a say. The ramification of this is that candidates are chosen by a small, unrepresentative portion of the electorate. Often it's the most vocal and extreme members of the party. So this is what happened in Wyoming when Representative Liz Cheney was knocked out of her seat by a much more extreme Republican because of her action against Trump. We also see moderate Republicans are much more likely than their extreme peers to want to take action on climate, but those candidates rarely make it through closed partisan primaries. In states that have closed primaries, general election voters get a choice between 2 extreme ends. Or, when districts are heavily one-sided, which many are, the partisan primary basically is what determines the winner of the general election. So the voters in the general election are just kind of rubber stamping whatever this small electorate in the primary chose. All of that contributes to partisan polarization, which preempts a lot of possibility for any good sense lawmaking and compromise. Parties end up doing more to tear each other down than actually working on long-lasting solutions. So that is an issue with the types of elections that we have. Another challenge is the method of voting. Many elections don't require candidates to win a majority of votes. So it means that 3 or more candidates can end up splitting the vote, and then somebody can win with a plurality, just at the most votes, rather than the support of an actual majority of the population. So in the image here, you can see that the 2 red candidates have similar viewpoints, but the voters are split between them. The blue candidate ends up winning the election with a plurality of votes, even though more than half of the voters prefer somebody else. So you might think of Ralph Nader taking votes away from Al Gore. A lot of people are worried about RFK Jr. in this November. To avoid this, a lot of voters will strategize, and they will vote not based on who they like, but who they think should win, who they think will win, rather than their actual favorite. No surprises, women, people of color, are rarely viewed as electable candidates. Third-party candidates are also discouraged from running because they're afraid that they would spoil the election for a major party candidate closest to them. So that means that voters are often left with two choices and have to choose between the lesser of two evils. This system doesn't let us make real choices based on the issues we care about and doesn't ensure that elected leaders support majority views. So it's not surprising that popular policies aren't always prioritized. Okay, so I mentioned some districts are heavily partisan and not competitive. And that's actually because they're drawn that way. A lot of elections for legislative bodies like the US House, state legislators, city councils, elect representatives by district. So I just have up here, Washington's congressional map. So under this system, getting a majority, or even just a plurality, as we just talked about, of votes means that winning the single district seat. Voters in this system are guaranteed geographical representation, but nothing else. So if you don't agree ideologically with the majority of voters in your district, you get no say in that governing body. If you're in a district with a big stable majority, say 60% of the opposing party, you will never get a say. So it means that the way that the district lines are drawn becomes super important. It dictates whether you live with mostly other similar voters and can therefore elect somebody that you like, or mostly next to other people with opposing views, in which case you're out of luck. We can try to draw districts that would make a legislative body representative of the population, or with districts that are all split between all of the parties, but that's pretty difficult. So you can see in these graphics, which might be a little bit hard to see, but we'll see. In this polity, the dots are the voters, and the boxes or the shapes that are drawn around them are the districts that would be represented by one person. Voters in this polity lean 54% Democratic, which is blue. So you can draw either compact districts and get an unrepresentative legislature, like the first one, which has a legislature that's only 45% Democratic. So the Republicans in this case actually have the majority. Or you can draw a bunch of weird-looking shapes, which is in the second picture, to achieve a representative outcome. And even then, the districts are only going to guarantee representation based on where you live and not what you think. Gerrymandering, which is when elected leaders can essentially choose their own voters by drawing the lines that they want, makes this worse. And it's become quite a boogeyman among sort of people worried about our elections. But gerrymandering isn't the full story, because even independent redistricting commissions that have drawn lines around contiguous communities create safe, highly partisan districts because communities are increasingly self-sorted by ideology. The result is that there are very few swing districts left. Out of the 435 US House seats, experts can pretty reliably predict about 400 of them. So in effect, this means that a lot of voters actually live in a one-party system, and that can be pretty disempowering. When you're the sole red dot in a blue sea, you can keep voting for a red candidate all you want, and they will never be elected. You can imagine that that might feel frustrating. All right, on that cheery note, one more issue to add to the pile, and that is money. Campaigns are super expensive. It takes billions of dollars to run for Congress, as this chart shows, but even campaigning for a mayor of somewhere like Portland, Oregon, routinely costs nearly $1 million. Elected leaders listen to their biggest donors, and money does seem to matter. In 2012, 95% of the US House candidates who spent more money won their election. Part of that is probably donations to safe candidates to open up access, but that says something too. There are disclosure and spending rules, but PACs and super PACs, also known as dark money, can get around them and ensure that people and interest groups with big pocketbooks can largely run the show. When the people in office aren't incentivized to listen to their constituents, they aren't going to figure out how to meet their needs and prioritize what they want. All right, I don't know about you, but I'm ready for some solutions. Fortunately, we do have some tools to help. So I'll go through these briefly, and then I'll focus in on examples in Washington. So we can boost voter participation through mechanisms like automatic voter registration, vote by mail, including paid envelopes, and changing election timing to meet voters when they vote rather than making them fill out ballots again and again. Rather than closed primaries, we can have open, nonpartisan primaries that welcome all voters. Ranked choice voting solves the issue of plurality winners and spoiler candidates by allowing voters to rank their candidates based on who they like the best. Proportional representation ensures that voters get to elect a candidate of their choice, even when they aren't part of the majority in their district. And lastly, public financing of elections, particularly through innovative programs like democracy vouchers, can bring more people into the campaign financing conversation and dilute the power of big money. All right, diving in a little bit deeper. So we fought for automatic voter registration, mail-in ballots, complete with paid postage, to boost voter participation in Washington state. Recently, we've been turning to another simple fix, and that's changing the timing of elections. So across states, across local jurisdictions, voter turnout is a lot lower in odd-numbered years than in even years, which is when federal elections are on the ballot. So this chart shows how much lower turnout is in large Washington cities in odd years compared to even years, the turnout penalty. Washington state currently requires odd-year local elections, forcing cities to hold elections in these low turnout times. We've been working to change that through a local option bill in the state legislature that would simply allow cities to make the shift in timing if they want to. This year, the bill passed the state house, but didn't make it out of the Senate before deadline. So we will be coming back around to that next year. All right, so as I've said, Washington already has open, nonpartisan primaries, thanks to a voter initiative in 2004 and some subsequent court cases. So we can check that box. Here, all voters vote in just one primary election, and the top two candidates move on to the general election. But the top two system still has some issues. It intends to solve the spoiler issue by mandating only 2 people in the general election, but we just end up with spoiler candidates in the primary instead. So shown here is the 2016 race for state treasurer. In the primary, 5 people ran, including 3 Democrats and 2 Republicans. Democratic voters didn't align on a candidate, split their votes between the 3, and so the top 2 finishers ended up being both Republican, and the general election was between those 2. Even though more than half of the voters preferred a Democrat. So it's still not the most representative outcome. That leads us to our next reform, ranked choice voting. Ranked choice voting allows voters to rank candidates in order of preference, like the sample ballot shown here. Ranked choice voting is used in more than 50 jurisdictions across the US, including statewide in Alaska, where it's combined with nonpartisan open primaries. So in Alaska, the top 4 candidates from the open primary move forward, and then the general election uses ranked choice voting to determine the final winner. Ranked choice voting guarantees a majority winner and prevents spoiler candidates. That's because it functions like an instant runoff. So first choice votes are counted first. If there's a majority winner, they win. If no candidate wins a majority of first choice votes, then the candidate with the fewest number of votes is eliminated. Anyone who voted for that candidate gets their second choice counted instead. That process continues until there's a majority winner. So I'll walk through that here. This is an election for the best berry. In the first round, blueberry is ahead, but still doesn't reach the threshold of winning. So raspberry is in last place, gets eliminated, and the votes transfer. Blueberry is still ahead, but we still don't have a majority winner. So the last place votes transfer. Again, salmonberry is eliminated. And finally, that puts blueberry over the top, and blueberry wins the election. So with this method, voters have the ability to express their real preferences without worrying about who they think is going to win. Because if their first choice doesn't have enough votes, then they still get a say through their second choice. Again, it's kind of like an instant runoff. So this could help members of a party like the Green Party or other third-party candidates, because voters could show their support for those candidates even if they don't think that candidate's going to win. The Green Party candidate then can say, hey, I got 20% of the first choice votes. Clearly people care about environmental issues. We've also seen that negative campaigns are punished with ranked choice voting because candidates are encouraged to talk to more voters, reach beyond their typical base to look for those second choice votes. So one of the city council candidates in St. Paul, which uses ranked choice voting, said, "I door knocked on a number of people who had signs up for my opponent. The conversation didn't have to stop because they had already pledged to someone else." More women and other underrepresented candidates also tend to run and win under ranked choice voting. And studies show that governments with a higher proportion of women elected leaders have better climate policies. In Washington, Seattle will be using ranked choice voting starting in 2027, but only in the primary elections. And that's because state law currently mandates that we have the top two system I talked about earlier. So we've been working on another local options bill in the state legislature to allow cities and others to use ranked choice voting if they want to, not just in the primary. We're hoping to make a little bit more progress on that in next year's legislative session. Okay, so instead of winner-take-all districts, proportional districts with multiple winners would mean that all voters can have a say. With proportional representation, candidates and parties win seats in a legislative body in proportion to their share of the votes. So if the Green Party, for example, has 20% of the votes, they will get 20% of the seats. You're probably most familiar with that in a parliamentary democracy, but it could work here as well. This is better than trying to draw districts to be representative of the population because specific voting groups don't have to be in the same geographic area in order to elect a candidate of their choice. Proportional representation also nullifies the impact of gerrymandering, which you can see in this little mock-up of Boston, because it makes the lines irrelevant. Most advanced democracies around the world use some form of proportional representation. They end up with more parties that better represent a range of constituent viewpoints and higher voter turnout since people know that their votes actually matter. The parties who get elected have to form coalitions and work together, and the policies are maintained more consistently since there isn't the same flip-flopping of political power that we see here. Bringing this idea back to climate, research has also shown that governments set stricter environmental policies under proportional as opposed to winner-take-all systems. We can implement proportional representation through another version of ranked choice voting that elects multiple winners, and that's actually a major reason why we like the single winner ranked choice voting. The ballot looks the same, but the tabulation allows multiple candidates to be elected proportionally. Starting this November, voters in Portland, Oregon are actually going to use this multi-winner ranked choice voting to elect their new city council. They'll be the biggest city in the US to use it, which is super exciting. Here in Washington, a recent state Supreme Court case also specified that ranked choice voting, and particularly the multi-winner form, is a remedy for violations of the Washington Voting Rights Act, which is another way to expand opportunities for this solution. Lastly, campaign finance. So we also have an innovative, first-of-its-kind program here in Seattle, democracy vouchers. Democracy vouchers help dilute the power of big moneyed interests by giving everybody a chance to be part of campaign fundraising. With this program, all Seattle residents are mailed $25 vouchers to contribute to city candidates. Candidates who opt in have to abide by lower contribution limits, spending limits, and participation in debates. Seattle now has one of the highest proportion of residents who contribute to local elections for any city in the US, rather than a very small pool of large donors. We haven't updated this chart yet with the most recent numbers, but the number of campaign donors in Seattle continues to grow. Voucher users are more descriptively representative of the city as a whole than our cash donors. There are also more women and people of color in elective office. The average age of candidates has decreased since the program's start, although that's, of course, there's a lot of other factors at play in those metrics. One candidate said, "I saw it as a huge organizing tool to get people re-engaged with democracy," showing that candidates use democracy vouchers as a reason to reach out to more residents as potential contributors as well as voters. There's more to do here because independent expenditures still have influence on elections here in Seattle, but it's a promising start. It can really incentivize candidates who are elected to keep listening to their constituents and not just their biggest donors. Democracy vouchers are up for renewal next year, so this will be coming before City Council again soon. All right, let's bring this back to where we started. In some cases, as I mentioned, there's some research about how an electoral shift could help climate policy. It's hard to make a definitive causal connection. There's just too many factors at play. And there are also a lot of different aspects of environmental policy. Fundamentally, these changes are about making our democracy more representative of our communities. We know that people do care about climate change. If we can better align policymakers with their constituents, if we can build back trust in our agency as a public, we'll be much better poised to tackle all aspects of this issue and many more. When democracies are strong, when people believe that their vote matters, that they are represented, and that their leaders listen, it means that we, the collective we, are confident that we can solve big problems together. We need that willpower in order to tackle the collective crisis of climate change. And that's why shoring up our democracy is so essential. I will end there. I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you.
We have people on each section with a mic, so please raise your hand and we'll try to take people in order.
I'll ask the first question.
Great.
Any comments on Citizens United?
Yeah, so that's actually not something that I have researched in depth, but I would say that it cut a gaping hole in our, campaign fundraising system. There was some, from my knowledge of it, there was some, a decent amount of governance over some of what was spent on elections, and that just opened up an entire can of worms, and you can't put that back. So, only brief comments.
What things stood out in that research that you did? And what distinguishes the body that you mentioned, Nancy?
Related to Citizens United? Is that the... yeah, I don't know that I'm the best person to speak to that. We focus mostly on kind of regional projects. Looks like Bill wants to jump in. Oh, you had a question. Okay. Yeah, I think it's because of it opened up dark money and independent expenditures to our elections. And so it made it so that corporations now have a voice and sort of an official voice in our elections. That's problematic because we see that they can now have a lot more direct influence and can spend basically sort of unlimited amounts of money in a lot of our elections. Is that related to your question?
So are you saying that's a good thing?
Oh, no. So that's a bad thing.
So
Yep.
how can we fight that?
Well, now we're getting to the hard questions. Yeah, I think that I would say I hope that some of the reforms that I talked about can kind of gradually change some of our elections. When you change people who are in office, hopefully you can change some of who is in charge of appointing court nominees. The Supreme Court is a tough one, especially because there are no term limits. There are obviously we have a very conservative court right now. There's been a couple of issues with that. Yeah, I'm trying to think if there's anything else I want to say to that. I don't know. Short answer.
You're talking about proportional voting. If I understand what you're saying, if a party wins, say, 20% of the vote, so they get 20% of the seats, say, in our House of Representatives, is that constitutional, first? And second, how do you decide what seats they get if they don't win a majority in any district in the country? How are they going to represent a district?
Yeah, so for the U.S. House, it is not constitutional. So if we were to change it, if we were to change the U.S. House to be proportionally elected, it would have to be a constitutional amendment. Where we have been looking for proportional representation is a little bit more in the state. I think we've been hoping for even sort of city councils like what Portland is doing. I think we'd love to build towards state legislatures. And so the way that would work is not the same districts that we have now, but that there would be fewer larger districts, and each of those districts would elect multiple people. So there actually is a bill that was introduced, the Fair Representation Act for the U.S. House, to move in this direction. And I think what they propose is districts that are 3 to 5 members each, and elected proportionally using this multi-winner ranked choice voting. And so what happens then, if you have take a state like, trying to think about, Montana only has one House member. Wyoming, I think also only one. But so some of these districts that have a few more, say there's 5 House representatives in a state, they would all get elected for the whole state. But when they're elected proportionally, if there are 40% Democrats, 40% Republicans, then they would each get, let me do my math, they would each get 2 seats, right? And then perhaps there's one independent or a Constitution Party member who gets elected. And so rather than what you see in current states that have Washington is a lot of blue, although I think some mixed. A lot of the states in the South have a lot of particularly Republican representatives, and even though they're not 100% Republican in those states, their lawmakers are 100% Republican, and that's because within the district, all of the members in the district are there's just a majority of voters in the district. If you have a majority, you win. So with multi-member districts, even if you're in a slight minority of voters, you still get to have a say in some of that elected body. Good question.
Thank you so much. I don't know whether to comment on what your age is and my age is, but I leave hopeful because you are young and you have given your attention and energy to such an important issue. And I am older and absorb what I can absorb, but thank you so much for your youth, for your enthusiasm, for your intellect. I really appreciate that you're diving into this because it gives all of us very much hope for the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
What are some of the steps that we can take at this age and stage?
Yeah, well, fortunately, I think most of you are already voting, so we got that one checked off. There is, as we have legislative work that comes up, I think there's engagement to be done there. I think it sounds like a lot of you are also already engaged in the legislative process. But I think as we're working on bills to move forward ranked choice voting and even year elections, I think you could sign up for our email list at Sightline, and we can send out some notices of when to contact your state legislators and tell them, oh, I heard that this bill is moving. I really want you to support it. So that's another way of getting engaged. I also think, I think the talk the other day I heard said something about sort of talk about climate change. I think also talk about some of these election reforms. Start learning about ranked choice voting. If you're trying to decide on a group dessert, you can use ranked choice voting. and kind of try to kind of introduce people to the concept and the idea of some of these, like there are new, tried and true, but new for some people, methods of change. And so starting those conversations and really kind of bringing up the ideas can really help.
What would be those key avenues?
For any of these changes? Yeah, I mean, I think any of the, do you mean like in sort of to talk about amongst yourselves, or? Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of what sort of talked about tonight of these electoral methods, I think contacting your city council members and telling them that you appreciate public financing of elections is a good one, especially because the democracy voucher program will be up for renewal next year. Learning more about how all of them work as well, and thinking through what that could look like for you and for communities around. And yeah, I think talking to people here about it, and then also talking to people that come visit you and people that you see out in the world, kind of introducing that there too.
Well, I want to know a little more about the democracy vouchers, which is, one is remind me when they started, and then tell me I'm thinking they only apply to city council elections, and when, of the number that are distributed. In other words, I think, do they go to everybody in the city, or do they go to every registered voter? And then finally, of the ones that are actually sent out, what's the percent that are actually used?
Yeah, okay, let's see if first of all, I would say I'm not an expert. There is a book coming out about the democracy voucher program that should be out in the fall. So if you want the up-to-date numbers, you'll have to check there. So let's see what we got. The vouchers are mailed to every Seattle resident, so it's not just registered voters, and that was an intentional choice. I think of the vouchers that have been returned, it's actually a fairly small percentage of the vouchers that are sent out that get used and get sent in. Part of that is because I think people leave them on their shelf and forget about them. Part of it is also when there are pretty low kind of topping out maxes, and so once a candidate reaches a certain amount of vouchers, they can't accept anymore. And so oftentimes what happens is somebody sends in a voucher, but the voucher actually isn't used because the candidate has already reached their max level of vouchers that they can accept. So I think we only see, I want to say it's like 6% returned, but I don't actually know what that number is off the top of my head. And then you had another question in the beginning. Oh yeah, I think, well, so the program started in 2015, and it was through a ballot initiative there. So it's a 10-year, and I think it's a property tax levy. So that's why it's up for renewal next year. And I think one of the major, we were talking about this at dinner too, I think one of the major challenges for the program is going to be a funding source, and making sure that there's a sustainable funding source to continue the program.
Well, I know another problem, which is, I mean, they haven't even closed they haven't closed filing yet for the coming election, but I got democracy vouchers a month ago for this coming election. So the timing is like, what are they thinking?
Yeah, and they want them to be available so that candidates can really sort of start because they need money early. But I mean, I agree with you. My democracy vouchers are hidden somewhere on a shelf. Like, I don't, so I think that they're really working on and thinking through a lot of those changes. You can always submit comments to the Seattle Ethics and Elections Committee, is the one who manages the program, and I think they actually do appreciate hearing from people about how they use the program, and some of the improvements that can be made. So you could send them a note if you wanted to, but they also, because they can be used in primary elections, they want to make sure that the candidates can get that money before then.
Does your organization have any influence on what is taught in schools? If we could have more civics classes, explanation to kids what it means to be a voter, an American for that matter, maybe it would, well, I think it would help.
Yeah. My organization does not have any educational sort of program. We don't work with schools at all. But I think you make a great point. I do think that more civics education would help. And I think not just even about voting, but what it means to be sort of, participate civically in general. And, other aspects of that too. I think of what it means to be a good community member and kind of a good citizen in the broad kind of classical sense.
The Washington State League of Women Voters has a textbook that tries to get that information to the elementary schools.
Great.
I'm confused about the representative or proportional districts.
Yep.
And I read in the paper about the brouhaha in Central Washington and Yakima. Are you aware of that? I mean, can you tell us? Because I didn't understand why they divided the district that was. The community felt that they had a voting block that could elect someone to the Washington State legislature, and then the powers that be came in and said, oh, you have too many of this or something, and they split it up. Am I wrong?
Yeah, so what I understand about what's happened in Yakima, and I haven't been involved at all, so it's mostly just sort of keeping up on it in the news, is that they had certain lines drawn for their districts, but they have a high proportion of Latino or Hispanic voters in Yakima, and there's enough evidence that a lot of those voters vote kind of as a block, for one candidate or another, and so that's in order to prove something under sort of voting rights rules, you need to prove that that's like one of the standards that you need to prove is that. One, that there are communities of interest, and then that are geographically sort of like part of a district, and two, that they tend to vote as a block. And so I think the case there showed that they did vote as a block, but because they were separated by the district lines, they were not able to elect a candidate of their choice. And I also, it's worth focusing on sort of a candidate of their choice. Doesn't necessarily mean somebody who is Hispanic or Latino, but it means somebody that they want to elect. And so that's why they were like, oh, we have to redraw these lines in order to better figure out how to make the district more representative of this group in particular, because they are a majority of voters. Now, again, that's sort of a focus on the drawing of the lines. If they instead got to elect, it was a slightly larger district, and they got to elect multiple members of the district, then you wouldn't have to worry as much about the lines, because if say Latino voters are 40% of the population, and even if there's only sort of 3 candidates who are elected, they would be sure to be able to elect at least one, because they would get sort of a third of those, at least a third of those votes. So let me think about a better way to explain the proportional representation. In Portland, what they're actually doing is they used to elect all of the city councilors. They were commissioned, city commissioners at large, and so the whole city would vote for every single commissioner. So The problem with voting at large is that if there are blocks of voters, and so let's say, because we're thinking about race here, let's say it's white voters, let's say most white voters vote all together and they make up a majority of voters, let's say they make up 55%. If they pick 4 white candidates in an at-large election, they actually get to choose all 4, because candidate number 1 gets a majority winner, candidate number 2 gets a majority winner, and so on for each of the candidates. So there is no proportional representation when you're voting at large for a city council. With what Portland is now changing to is actually 4 districts, and each of the districts are going to elect 3 members each, and the 3 members will be elected via proportional representation. And so that means that if there are certain voters in a district, and let's say that there are, there's sort of 40% and 40% and 20% breakdown of the electorate, let's say blue, red, and purple, then there's going to be a blue person elected, a red person elected, and a purple person elected, because those are the sort of like the biggest vote chunks. Whereas if you had districts, you would have to think about, okay, the purple voters actually tend to be more blue, and so they would then, perhaps they would sort of have to choose between a red and a blue candidate, and maybe they'd end up with a district that was like all blue, that was just one representative, and it was just a blue representative. I don't think that was very satisfying.
Is the proportion decided by, then do voters have to declare their party?
No.
Well, who waves the wand that gives them a certain percentage?
So there is actually, I could maybe see if I can pull it up here, and we could play a little video for you about how the proportional ranked choice voting works. Are we interested in that? If we can make it work, okay.
What happens like in the Italian parliament where you have so many minority candidates, nothing happens. And you see what happened in Israel where you have minority prime minister because he had the support of multiple parties. So you could have that happen in this proportional where you have a government of minorities where nothing happens.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. There are trade-offs in any system, right? What happens here in this country instead is that a minority faction gets to basically sort of take control over one of the 2 parties, since we only have 2 parties. And so we actually have minority rule in this country. And so proportional representation is actually a way of, at least some of these voices actually sort of become part of the process and are included in some of the more official conversations, rather than being totally sidelined and then having to take sort of extra governmental action in order to make changes that they want to see and building support sort of publicly. But I think it's a good question, because you do see it, like, nobody's figured it out, right? I mean, I think the classic quote of democracy is the worst form of government except for anything else. Right? That nobody's solved all the problems yet. Yeah. Okay, we're gonna watch a little video here.
Vote for your favorite colors.
The instant runoff way.
Now with fractions. We already showed you how instant runoff elections work when there's only one winner.
But when there's more than one winner, it's a little more complicated.
We have 5.
And let me just say, instant runoff is what they're calling ranked choice voting. So instant runoff and ranked choice voting are often used sort of synonymously. And so they're going to use little sticky notes to kind of go through what it looks like to allocate votes in this election.
And we're going to end up with 3 winners.
To start, each voter chooses a favorite color, a second choice, and a third.
All right, purple is my first choice, yellow comes in second, and I'll put blue in third place.
Now we need a scoreboard. There were 36 votes cast. There will be 3 winners.
In order for a color to win, it needs more than a quarter of the vote. That's because if a color gets that much, then it's mathematically impossible for it to lose.
36 divided by 4 is 9, and we need just over that.
So plus 1 is 10.
10 votes is the finish line.
Make it there, and you're one of the 3 winners.
So let's count the votes.
No one's reached the finish line yet. That means it's time for round 2.
And orange got the fewest votes, so it's out.
Everyone who voted for orange first now gets their second choice.
Purple reached the finish line.
In fact, purple has more votes than it needs.
That means each purple voter can take back a fraction of their vote and still leave purple with enough to win.
Under instant runoff.
So I'll just add to that. They're going to take a, so it's also called single transferable vote, and that's because once you've reached this threshold in order to win, the votes beyond that are like excess. And so you don't want to have somebody who is voting, you don't want to have people who are voting for just a super popular candidate, and then that candidate gets elected but with like 80% of the vote, and then the other candidates might not sort of have the same level of support. And so you want to redistribute whatever the excess is for those candidates that have already earned a seat. And so that's what's about to happen here, is that these kind of the extra votes are going to get transferred, but they get transferred proportionally based on all of the voters' second choices.
Exactly what they get to do.
Purple has 2 votes to spare.
And that gets divided among the 12 purple voters.
So each of them gets 1/6 of their vote back.
And that little piece will go to their next choice.
Now blue has reached the finish line.
No votes to spare.
So no more fractions. Green is in last place. You know the drill.
Most of these votes are for colors that have already won or are already out.
We call those ballots exhausted.
Yellow didn't quite make it to the finish line, but there's no one else left.
So we have our 3 winners.
The instant runoff way.
There you go. So it gets a little bit, it gets a little more complicated when there's multiple winners. Yeah.
Is it also over here?
Thanks.
Is there also a chance of more manipulation of votes? And, how in the heck do you supervise all of this?
That's a great question. So because there are, once you have defined rules in your election, you can go through and you can sort of figure out, okay, what actually would the fractions be, even if it's, thousands of people voting rather than just 36 here. So you can actually do it. There are a couple of open source software tools, and we didn't get into any sort of implementation discussion, but there's a group called the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center that has developed like a software tool that's open source and fully sort of transparent. So you can put in what's called a cast vote record, which is basically sort of a electronic copy of the ballot into the system. And once you put in a bunch of those, then it'll spit out the outcome, and you can see round by round how many of the votes, what were the first choice votes, and you can actually sort of look and see line by line what were all of these ballots. So if you have the cast vote record, you can tell what all of the ballots say, and then you can actually sort of do the results yourself if you want to. And so there's not a lot of, as long as there's some transparency in the system, there's not a lot of opportunity for funny business going on. So there's definitely ways to, it's something that people are concerned about, especially as you start thinking about like, oh, what is this? It's fractions and math, and it's, it's a process that's harder to understand. But once you do understand it, it's actually, you can actually sort of work through it yourself.
The reason I asked that question was reading an article in the New York Times about why we don't have voting rights on our iPhone, because it's too easy to hack. And if you're using a computer to do all of this, it, to me, looks like an open way to hack in and change things.
Yeah, so actually none of the computers that do this for any of the election systems are connected to the internet. And so there's all of the cast vote records are submitted to through election portals through like a super secure portal. And so all of that data has a very defined chain of custody and figuring out sort of like where the opportunities might be. And because they have embedded the like ranked choice voting like sort of module or whatever in the actual ballot counting software, so it all happens in that one place before anything is connected to the internet, before anything sort of is really transferred anywhere other than kind of the actual ballots that are already transferred anyway.
And you said they have this. Who is the they?
Oh, election administrators. So whoever, and it varies by state or by county, who, you know, which jurisdiction, and here it's mostly county based, that are really sort of counting all of those votes and tabulating the elections. Yeah, it's good. That's a great question.
Sounds like lots of food for thought, lots of complication to think through and to read more about. Are there any more questions? Thank you all very, oh, Tom?
I don't want to keep people much longer, but it seems to me that everything is so complicated that what would be useful to have are 2 bullet points to get people organized around. In other words, if there's going to be any change, people are going to have to come out and support it. And so what are the 2 key things that you'd like to have people organized around?
Yeah, I mean, I think I can speak to, I think, what was successful in Portland and in organizing Portland for change. I think the first one is what we have is not working. And that's a pretty good incentive to try something new. And I think the second point is there are other places that have done this. Ireland uses this proportional representation, ranked choice voting. Australia as well. There are other countries that have used it. Cambridge, Massachusetts has been using it for a long time. And so change is possible and needed, I would say, the main things. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And feel free to come up and talk to Shannon. But I appreciate your being here, and thank you very much, Shannon.
Okay, thank you.